Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. In Lagos, where the sun wakes before the roosters and the air carries the scent of ambition, lived Pastor Joel Benson, a man whose calmness could silence chaos. He wasn't the kind to make noise about miracles or dance in front of cameras. His ministry was quieter, like the hum of a well-tuned generator in the night. Constant, reliable, unnoticed yet essential. His church, Grace Fountain Assembly, sat between a printing shop and a suya joint, its walls painted cream and sky blue, its bells slightly cracked but faithful. Every Sunday, people came not because of banners or billboards, but because of the peace that wrapped around Joel's words like warm palm oil on yam. He had a way of speaking that made even the doubtful feel seen, and when he smiled, it was with the ease of a man who knew his place under heaven. Those who watched him closely, though, could tell his strength didn't come from his voice or his title. It came from the woman who shared his home, his pulpit, and his quiet victories. Miriam was the heart behind his heartbeat, the soft hand that steadied him when the world tugged too hard. Together they were like the morning and dew, inseparable yet distinct, and everyone who knew them believed they were living proof that love could survive Lagos traffic and temptation alike. In the evenings, when the sky wore its purple robe and horns blared from impatient buses, they would sit on their narrow balcony in Surulere, eating roasted corn from the woman downstairs, talking about little nothings. There, Joel would sometimes reach for her hand and whisper, "I married the peace I preach." She would laugh, her eyes shining like water under streetlight, and say, "Then you better keep preaching it at home too." Those moments were golden, fragile, fleeting but golden. Life around them was a dance between grace and grit. Joel's days began before sunrise, when he'd pace the sitting room with his Bible open, murmuring prayers that sounded like conversations with an old friend. He wasn't just a pastor, he was a counselor, a father figure to many, and a quiet listener to all. The neighborhood kids often ran to him when they fought over football, and the women at the market reserved his favorite plantains, calling him our pastor way no day shout. But even saints are men first, and Lagos had a way of stretching a man's soul thin. There were nights when Joel's mind would drift beyond his prayers, wondering if the path he chose had cost him too much of himself. Still, when he looked at Miriam sleeping, her breath steady, her palm resting open like a prayer unanswered, he would feel something anchor him back. She carried the home with the grace of a queen who needed no crown. Her laughter filled the small apartment like music, and her food, her food, could make sorrow forget its name. Miriam worked as a teacher in a private school nearby, where her patience was tested daily by spoilt children and their prouder parents, yet she never lost her calm. "Every child," she often said, "is a seed. You don't scold a seed, you nurture it." Joel adored her for that, though sometimes he worried she gave too much of herself to others. But that was Miriam, always pouring out, always believing that love, when shared, multiplies. Their marriage had weathered little storms, the kind that test but never tear. There was a year when money grew wings and flew away, when the church roof leaked like a stubborn secret, and Joel thought of giving up. But Miriam had looked him straight in the eyes and said, "When you stand in the rain long enough, even heaven notices." That became his anchor. He had learned that marriage, like ministry, wasn't about perfection but persistence. Some nights, after long counseling sessions, he'd come home drained, his voice worn thin from carrying other people's pain. Miriam would warm his food, rub his shoulders, and tell him stories about her day, stories that made him laugh even when his spirit was heavy. Their love wasn't loud, it was steady like the heartbeat of a faithful drum. And yet, beneath all the peace they shared, life waited patiently with its trickster's grin. Because happiness, though beautiful, is never without its shadows. Sometimes Joel caught himself staring too long at nothing, wondering if the world outside his pulpit held something more, something unnamed. He would shake it off quickly, ashamed of the thought, praying for his heart to remain still. The call came one breezy afternoon, while Miriam was marking her students' scripts. Joel had been invited to a pastor's conference in Abuja, a grand event, he was told, with speakers from every corner of the country. It was an honor, a sign that his ministry had grown roots deep enough to be noticed beyond Lagos. Miriam danced when she heard, her joy so full it made Joel blush. "See my husband," she teased, waving the letter. "Abuja go no say Lagos Pastor Day come." He smiled, pulling her close, feeling the warmth of her faith in him. He didn't know that sometimes blessings come wearing the face of a test. That evening, as they packed his things, Miriam slipped a small note into his Bible. He found it later that night on the flight. "Don't forget who you are, even when the world claps too loudly." He smiled, touched but unaware that her words would soon become a lifeline. As the plane lifted off the Lagos runway, Joel looked out at the city lights, blinking, restless, alive, and whispered a quiet prayer. But prayers, no matter how sincere, cannot always hold back the tide of destiny waiting to crash ashore. The Abuja air greeted Joel with a different rhythm, one that hummed with order and quiet pride. The city was polished like a Sunday shoe, its roads wide and trees disciplined in their alignment. As the taxi rolled past Wuz and into the heart of the capital, Joel felt a strange blend of awe and unease. Abuja lacked the raw pulse of Lagos, no Danfo drivers arguing mid-lane, no hawkers tapping at your window with gala and pure water. It was too calm, too structured, like a man who smiled but never laughed. The hotel where the conference held was large, its marble floors shining like still water, its air heavy with perfume and ambition. He checked in, greeted by ushers whose smiles were rehearsed, and made his way to his room on the third floor. Alone in the spacious room, he unpacked with care, folding his clothes as Miriam had done, hearing her voice in his head reminding him not to scatter things. He placed his Bible on the bedside table and read her note again. "Don't forget who you are." Those words seemed to hum under his skin. The next morning, as he walked into the conference hall filled with pastors and church leaders from across Nigeria, Joel felt like a small lamp among chandeliers. There was laughter, pride, and polished English everywhere. The sessions began, filled with sermons about growth, leadership, prosperity, words that sounded large but felt hollow in places. He spoke when asked, gently, his voice steady and warm, his words threading into the hearts of listeners like soft rain. It wasn't long before people began to notice him, some coming over after sessions to shake his hand and ask for advice. Among them, a woman with bright eyes and a voice like melody introduced herself as Clara Amaragb. Her handshake lingered a little too long, and her smile carried something unspoken, something that fluttered like a whisper beneath her polite words. Clara was unlike anyone Joel had met before. She wasn't loud, but her presence was sharp enough to leave an impression. She had that confident elegance that comes from knowing her beauty was a conversation of its own. Her laughter carried through the crowd like perfume, soft but deliberate, drawing attention without asking for it. During lunch breaks, she found ways to drift near Joel's table, greeting him with casual ease, asking thoughtful questions about his sermons. He noticed, but brushed it aside as mere friendliness. After all, he was married, and she was just another attendee. Yet something about her voice stayed with him, echoing faintly in his mind when the conference ended each day. One evening, as he waited in the hotel lobby for a taxi to take him to a pastor's dinner, Clara appeared again, holding her phone with a worried look. "Pastor Joel," she said, her tone soft, "I lost my room key. They said it'll take a while to fix the system. Can I sit here with you for a bit?" Joel hesitated. The lobby was full, brightly lit, and his conscience whispered that it was harmless. They talked about ministry, about music, about how lonely service could feel sometimes. Clara spoke of her struggles as a choir leader, how people judged her, how men assumed her faith was a disguise for ambition. Joel listened, offering kind words, his voice calm as ever. But beneath that calm, something stirred, a faint curiosity, a sympathy that felt almost like warmth. When her new key arrived, she smiled and said, "You have a peaceful spirit, Pastor. Not many men carry such calm." He nodded politely, said good night, but her words followed him up the stairs like perfume that refused to fade. As the days went by, Joel began to notice her everywhere, near the seminar doors, beside the coffee table, sometimes even at the edge of the crowd, her eyes searching until they found his. It unsettled him, though he told himself it was coincidence. But coincidences, repeated enough, become patterns. Clara began sending little notes after sessions, folded neatly, thanking him for his insights. He ignored the first few, but guilt made him respond to one, a brief line that read, "Thank you for listening. Stay strong." That simple exchange became a thread. She found him during the evening walks organized for the delegates, falling into step beside him, their conversation light, but increasingly personal. She spoke of her loneliness, how being a single woman in the church world made people suspicious of her, how she longed for understanding. Joel nodded, offering advice, unaware that her words were weaving a web around him. Each encounter left him slightly more vulnerable, like a door left ajar in the wind. He tried to pray it away, but temptation never comes with a warning bell. It comes dressed in the familiar, smiling, harmless, until it sits too close. On the third day, when a sudden rainstorm trapped them together under the hotel awning, Clara laughed softly and said, "You see? Even heaven doesn't want you to leave." It sounded like a joke, but Joel's pulse betrayed him. He smiled faintly, uncomfortable with the way her laughter lingered in his chest long after the rain stopped. That night, back in his room, sleep avoided him. He sat by the window, watching the city lights blink through the mist. The conference had been a success, his session had drawn applause, and his name was already being mentioned among senior ministers. Yet none of that felt as heavy as the silence now pressing against him. He thought of Miriam, her steady eyes, her laughter, her patience, and guilt pricked at his heart for even allowing another woman's face to hover in his thoughts. He opened his Bible, read from Proverbs, but the words swam before his eyes. His phone buzzed on the table. A message blinked. "Thank you for today. You remind me that good men still exist." It was from Clara. He stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering above the screen, then placed the phone face down, as if to bury the temptation under plastic and glass. But the mind has no off switch. Once curiosity takes root, it grows quietly like ivy against a wall. Joel prayed, whispering, "Lord, help me stay upright." But even prayers tremble when the heart begins to wander. He closed his eyes, unaware that a storm was already gathering, patient and deliberate, waiting for its hour to break. Joel woke up the next morning with a heavy chest, the kind of heaviness that doesn't come from tiredness, but from something the soul can't name. Abuja's morning light streamed through the curtains, painting the room in quiet gold, but instead of peace, it brought unease. He spent longer than usual in the shower, letting the water run over him, as if it could wash off thoughts that had started to feel too warm, too alive. After breakfast, he attended the final day of the conference, his words crisp, his tone firm, but inside him something trembled. Every time he caught sight of Clara in the crowd, sitting a few rows away, his pulse betrayed him. She smiled once, not a wide, careless grin, but a small knowing curve of the lips, and it landed on him like a whisper. When the conference ended, applause filled the hall, and Joel stood in the spotlight, shaking hands with other ministers, yet feeling as though a thread was pulling him elsewhere. That evening, when the crowd thinned and the laughter faded into hotel corridors, Joel lingered in the lobby with a coffee he barely touched. He told himself he was waiting for his flight itinerary, but deep down, he knew he was waiting for something else, though he couldn't admit it, not even to himself. He stared out through the glass wall of the lobby, watching cars slide by like restless thoughts. Then he heard her voice behind him, soft, familiar, uninvited yet expected. "You look like a man carrying the world," Clara said, sitting across from him without waiting for an answer. Her perfume floated between them, subtle yet demanding attention. He tried to smile. "Maybe just a little tired," he replied. "You should rest," she said gently. "You've given so much these past days. You deserve a little peace too." It was such an innocent sentence, yet it crawled under his ribs like heat. They talked longer than they should have. The conversation started with ministry and drifted, like smoke, into personal spaces, childhood memories, their fears, moments of loneliness they had never shared with anyone. Clara listened with the intensity of someone who didn't just want to hear, but to be remembered. Joel found himself laughing at her stories, surprised at how easy it was to talk to her. She wasn't pushy, only present. That was her power, the quiet persistence of a shadow that doesn't need to chase the light. When it was time to leave, she stood and said softly, "Thank you for listening. People rarely do." He nodded, trying to ignore the ache her absence left in the air. He went upstairs, trying to pray, but the words slipped through his fingers. That night, rain began again, slow at first, then fierce, pounding the windows like an impatient guest. He tried to sleep, but the storm outside echoed the one inside him. Around midnight, a knock came on his door. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but it came again, soft, steady. He opened it, and there stood Clara, drenched, shivering slightly, her umbrella broken in her hand. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "The hallway window burst open near my room. It's leaking badly. Can I wait here till the maintenance comes?" Joel froze. Logic screamed no, but compassion, or something that wore its face, said yes. He stepped aside. She entered, water glistening on her hair like tiny shards of glass. He handed her a towel, looking anywhere but at her. The room suddenly felt smaller, the silence louder, the rain outside more deliberate. She thanked him, her voice low, almost a whisper, and when their eyes met, time seemed to hold its breath. Joel told himself it was just a few minutes, that once the rain eased, she'd return to her room. But the rain refused to stop. They sat across from each other, speaking about nothing, both aware of everything. The hum of the air conditioner filled the space between their silences. Clara's laughter, when it came, was softer than before, fragile, the kind that hides something underneath. "You remind me of my father," she said suddenly, looking at him with eyes that glistened under the dim light. He was kind, strong, and lonely, even when surrounded by people. Joel felt something twist inside him. He wanted to tell her to leave, to remind her he was married, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe it was pity, maybe the loneliness of the traveling life, or maybe that quiet arrogance men feel when someone sees them too clearly. She shifted closer, the scent of her hair brushing against his restraint. He stood, pacing, saying something about integrity, but she only nodded, her gaze steady. The lightning outside flashed across her face, painting her in silver and shadow. When she reached out to touch his arm, it wasn't bold. It was tender, like someone asking for help in a language that wasn't words. And Joel, a man who had counseled others against temptation 100 times, found himself unable to move. There are moments when right and wrong blur into a single trembling heartbeat, and that night became one of them. The rain didn't stop, it only grew quieter, as if heaven had turned away. By morning, Abuja was washed clean, but Joel was not. The air smelled of wet earth and regret. Clara had left before dawn, leaving only the faint trace of perfume and a note that read, "Thank you for being human." He stared at it until the ink blurred in his vision. The man in the mirror looked the same calm eyes, same well-kept beard, but something in his reflection felt foreign. He moved like a man haunted by silence. As he packed his suitcase, Miriam's note fell from his Bible. He picked it up, fingers trembling. "Don't forget who you are." The words stung. He wanted to pray, but guilt strangled every attempt. He boarded the flight back to Lagos with a heart heavy enough to drown. As the plane rose, the clouds swallowed the city beneath him, and for a moment he wished they could swallow him too. He imagined Miriam waiting at home, smiling, asking about the conference, her trust as whole as ever. He pressed his palm to his chest and whispered into the hum of the aircraft, "Lord, let her never see my eyes the way they are now." The engines roared, drowning out the confession. When he landed, Lagos felt louder than usual, but no amount of noise could drown the sound of what had broken in him. He stepped into the familiar air, wearing his pastor's calm again like an old, frayed cloak, neat enough for the world but torn beneath the seams. When Joel returned to Lagos, the city welcomed him with its usual noise, impatient horns, street vendors shouting like preachers, and the distant rumble of life too busy to care for any man's private storms. But within him, a strange silence grew, thick and suffocating. Miriam met him at the airport, radiant as ever, her smile unshaken, her faith in him untouched. She hugged him like she always did, her arms soft, trusting, unaware she was holding a man carrying a ghost. "You look tired," she said gently, brushing dust from his shoulder. "The trip must have been hectic." He managed a smile, nodding, careful to keep his eyes steady. On the drive home, she spoke about her week, the children at school, a colleague's birthday, a neighbor's new baby, and he listened, or pretended to, his responses automatic. Every word she said pressed against the walls of his guilt. Each laugh she shared echoed like an accusation. When they reached home, she served his favorite meal, egusi thick with stockfish, and watched him eat with that quiet satisfaction of a woman whose love had never known suspicion. He wanted to tell her everything, to fall at her feet and beg for understanding, but fear wrapped itself around his throat. How do you confess to the one who sees you as light that you've danced with shadows? Instead, he praised the meal, forced a chuckle, and spoke about the conference, carefully omitting the one name that haunted him. That night, when Miriam fell asleep beside him, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The fan above whirred lazily, and in that sound he heard judgment. Each rotation whispered, "You did this. You did this." He turned on his side, watching the woman who had prayed for him for years, who had built his peace brick by brick. The sight of her face, calm and unguarded, broke him in places words couldn't reach. He wanted to cry, but guilt doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it just sits, heavy, refusing to move. The following days unfolded with deceptive calm. To everyone, Pastor Joel had returned from Abuja more inspired, more grounded. His sermons carried a strange weight, as though he'd touched something sacred and returned with a secret. The congregation whispered that their pastor had grown deeper in spirit. They didn't know the depth he spoke from was guilt. He preached about repentance with fire in his voice, and people wept without knowing he was crying through them. Miriam noticed the change, of course. Wives always do. She watched him more closely, how he avoided her eyes when she asked simple questions, how his laughter arrived late and left too soon. Once, she found him sitting on the balcony before dawn, staring into the street below, his coffee untouched. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "Just thinking," he said, forcing a smile. "About what?" she pressed. "About Grace," he answered, and that was all. He began spending longer hours at church, locking himself in his office with prayer books and silence. The members said their pastor was pressing deeper into God's presence, but Miriam knew it was something else. When she visited the church one evening to bring him dinner, she found him kneeling, head bowed, whispering words too broken to form sentences. She placed the food quietly on the desk, and when he noticed her, he wiped his face quickly. "You didn't have to come," he said, trying to sound casual. "I wanted to," she replied. The distance between them that night was more than physical. It was spiritual, invisible, the kind of distance that grows in silence and eats at love one heartbeat at a time. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Miriam found a piece of paper tucked inside Joel's jacket. It wasn't a note she had written. The handwriting was too curvy, too unfamiliar. The words were simple, harmless on the surface. "You make faith feel alive." But harmless words become daggers when your heart is uncertain. She froze, staring at it, the fabric soft in her trembling hands. For a long time, she said nothing. That night, she served dinner as usual, her smile measured, her laughter rehearsed. Joel noticed something different in her eyes, a quiet storm forming, one she was trying hard to cage. "You're quiet tonight," he said, spoon hovering midair. "Maybe I'm just tired," she replied. But her voice betrayed her. She looked at him too long, as though memorizing his face before it changed into someone else's. Later that night, while he prayed beside the bed, she stood by the window, staring out at the streetlights. "Joel," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "is there something I should know?" He froze mid-sentence. His throat tightened. "No," he repeated, pretending not to understand. "Something you forgot to tell me," she continued, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside. The silence stretched, thick enough to choke on. "No," he managed, his voice small, almost lost. She nodded slowly, not convinced but unwilling to break yet. That night, they lay side by side but worlds apart, their bodies touching, their souls retreating. Sleep came to her late, but when it did, her dreams were loud with questions. The following week, life in their home became an act. Two actors playing a marriage they no longer felt sure of. Joel tried to drown his guilt in good deeds, organizing outreach programs, counseling troubled couples, visiting the sick. But every act of kindness only reminded him of his own betrayal. He became restless, his smiles thin, his words clipped. Miriam, on her part, became quieter. Her laughter disappeared from the walls. Her songs in the kitchen faded into silence. The air in their home grew heavy, carrying things neither of them dared to name. One evening, Joel returned from church to find her sitting at the dining table, the note spread open before her like evidence. His breath caught. Their eyes met, hers steady calm, but filled with something deeper than anger, disappointment. She didn't shout. She didn't throw the note. She only asked, "Who is Clara?" His heart dropped into his stomach. For a long time, he said nothing. Words became useless, heavy with fear. "She was someone from the conference," he began slowly, but the sentence crumbled in his mouth. "Someone," Miriam repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. He nodded weakly, guilt painting his face before words could. She closed her eyes, exhaled shakily, and whispered, "You've broken something we built with prayer." Her words were soft, but they hit him like a hammer. Joel fell to his knees, tears spilling, begging, explaining, confessing. But some wounds are too deep for instant mercy. Miriam stood, her face pale but composed. "Don't touch me," she said gently, stepping back. "Just give me space." She left the room, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Joel stayed kneeling long after she'd gone, his tears falling into the silence, tasting like salt and ashes. The house felt different after Miriam's footsteps faded into the night. The air hung heavy with silence, the kind that hums like electricity after a storm. Joel sat on the floor for a long time, unable to move, watching shadows crawl across the wall. The note lay on the table where she'd left it, glowing faintly under the lamp like something sacred turned sinful. He reached for it once, then drew his hand back, as if it might burn him. He wanted to run after her, to beg until her tears stopped, but fear rooted him in place. The walls that once echoed with laughter now swallowed every sound, and the ticking clock became a cruel reminder that peace had an expiry date. The following morning, the scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, soft, floral, haunting. Her clothes were still in the wardrobe, her toothbrush still by the sink, but the absence of her voice made the house feel hollow. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching her things, hoping they'd talk back. When his phone rang, it startled him. It was Deacon Bassie from church, cheerful, asking about the next Sunday's service. Joel forced his tone steady, said everything was fine, that God was good. But the words came out cracked, like a pot long used and newly fractured. After the call, he slumped onto the sofa, head in hands, whispering her name. The guilt had grown claws by now, scratching at the edges of his sanity. He wanted to pray, but how do you talk to heaven when you've betrayed its trust in the heart of another? That night, he didn't sleep. He watched dawn arrive, slow and cruel, painting the city in dull gold. The world outside moved on, buses honked, vendors shouted, lovers quarreled, but his own world had stopped spinning. By the second week, Miriam still hadn't returned. She sent no calls, no messages. The silence was its own answer. The church members noticed his sermons shortening, his smiles forced. Some said their pastor looked more spiritual, mistaking his brokenness for depth. He preached on forgiveness one Sunday and almost couldn't finish. His voice shook when he said, "Sometimes the hardest forgiveness to ask for is the one you don't think you deserve." The congregation murmured their amens, unaware that he was talking to a woman who wasn't in the room. After service, he avoided their compliments and locked himself in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass cabinet. He looked older, his eyes duller. The image mocked him. That evening, Deacon Bassie invited him for dinner, hoping to lighten his mood. Joel went, forcing conversation, but his mind stayed elsewhere. When he returned home, the darkness felt heavier than before. He sat on the edge of the bed that still smelled faintly of Miriam and whispered, "Please come home," though he knew she couldn't hear him. Days melted into each other. He cooked less, spoke less, and moved like someone dragging invisible chains. On Thursday, he received a letter, no name on the envelope, only his address. Inside, Clara's handwriting stared back at him. "I didn't mean to destroy anything. I hope you find peace." He tore it into pieces before finishing the line, as if shredding paper could erase memory. The wind from the window carried the scraps to the floor, and Joel watched them flutter like dying moths. He knew now that sin doesn't shout, it whispers until you lean close enough to fall. Miriam, meanwhile, stayed with her sister in Yaba, spending her nights staring at the ceiling, wondering when pain becomes anger and anger becomes numbness. She didn't hate Joel, not entirely. She hated the betrayal, the ease with which trust had shattered. Her sister urged her to talk to him, to at least hear him out, but Miriam wasn't ready. Every time she remembered his voice saying, "I love you," it felt like hearing a favorite song ruined by static. Some nights she prayed for him, but even those prayers were half-hearted, whispered between sighs. Joel called once, his voice small, hesitant. "Miriam, please, can we talk?" There was a long silence, and then she said softly, "What's there left to say?" He tried to answer, but the words got lost somewhere between guilt and longing. "I made a mistake," he managed. "Just one moment, but it broke everything." Her breath hitched. "That's the thing about moments, Joel. They last longer than you think." She ended the call before he could reply. The line went dead, and with it, another piece of him did too. That night, she cried quietly, so her sister wouldn't hear. Love doesn't die overnight. It fades like old paint, one shade at a time, leaving behind walls that remember too much. The scandal came quietly, as all secrets eventually do. Someone had seen Clara's message months before, screenshotted it, and now whispered versions of the story began to drift through the congregation. At first, it was disbelief. Our pastor? Never. But gossip is water. It finds its way through any crack. Soon, his assistant stopped meeting his eyes, and church attendance dipped. One woman in the choir resigned without explanation. Joel could feel it, the shift, the way people's greetings grew shorter, the way respect thinned into politeness. When he climbed the pulpit now, the silence wasn't reverent, it was curious. They watched him as though expecting him to confess publicly. One Sunday, as he preached about redemption, a baby cried from the back row, and in that tiny wail, Joel felt something break inside. After service, he locked himself in the vestry, face in his hands, whispering prayers that tasted like blood and salt. He had built his life on trust, and now it stood in ruins. That evening, he walked through the city streets alone, past bars, bus stops, and beggars, every face reminding him how far he had fallen from himself. He bought a bottle of water from a roadside boy and handed him more money than necessary. The boy smiled, thanking him, and for a moment Joel felt tears press behind his eyes. Maybe, he thought, kindness was the only piece of grace he could still hold. When he got home, the house was darker than before. He turned off the lights, lay on the couch, and listened to the city hum, trying to believe that morning would bring something different. But guilt, once born, doesn't die with the night. It only learns to breathe in the dark. Months passed, and Joel moved through life like a man walking underwater. Everything sounded distant, muted, laughter, greetings, even his own voice. The church still stood, but it felt smaller now, emptier. Some members stayed out of loyalty, others out of pity, and a few because leaving would have felt too much like judgment. Joel no longer looked for their eyes when he preached. He looked at the floor, at his Bible, anywhere but their faces. His words were slower, stripped of the fire they once carried. He spoke of mercy, but his tone trembled, like a man teaching himself what he no longer believed he deserved. At home, the silence had become an old companion. The clock ticked like footsteps in an empty hallway, and dust gathered on the framed photos of happier days. One afternoon, he sat on the balcony, the same one where he and Miriam once shared roasted corn and laughter. The street below still bustled. Children chased tires, hawkers called out their wares, life went on. Yet he felt completely outside of it. He thought about calling Miriam again, but what could he say that he hadn't already said to the air 1,000 times? Sometimes he'd rehearse apologies under his breath, the kind that came from the deepest part of him, but by the time he reached for the phone, courage would betray him. At night, dreams came, sometimes her face, sometimes Clara's shadow, always ending the same, a heavy silence, a slow fading. He'd wake drenched in sweat, whispering prayers that no longer had words, just pain. One rainy evening, the doorbell rang. Joel's heart stuttered. He opened the door and found Miriam standing there, umbrella in hand, raindrops clinging to her lashes like tears. For a second, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with things unsaid. She looked at him, not with the warmth he remembered, but not with hatred either. It was the look of someone who had wrestled with pain long enough to wear it like skin. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. He stepped aside, his throat dry. She walked in, her presence filling the room with a kind of ache that felt almost holy. The smell of rain followed her inside. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her fingers intertwined, gaze fixed on nothing. "I didn't come to talk about the past," she said finally. "I've done enough of that in my head." Joel nodded, unable to trust his voice. "I came because," she hesitated, exhaling slowly, "because forgiveness isn't about you. It's about me trying to breathe again." The words struck him deeper than tears could. He sank into the chair opposite her, eyes wet, heart breaking open. "Miriam," he whispered, "I don't know how to make it right." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "You can't," she said gently. "Some things can only be accepted, not repaired." They sat in silence, the kind that carried both grief and grace. After a while, she stood, walking toward the balcony. "The city hasn't changed," she said softly, looking out at the wet street. "Only we have." Joel joined her there, careful to keep his distance. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the world humming quietly beneath the gray sky. For the first time in months, he breathed without pain. They spent the next hour speaking in half sentences about small things, the church roof, her students, a cousin's wedding, pretending not to notice how each word carried more weight than it should. Joel told her he was stepping down from the pulpit for a while, that he needed time to heal before he could speak for God again. She nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. "You always tried to save everyone," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to let yourself be saved." Her words lingered long after she said them. He asked if she was coming back home, and she didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "Home isn't just a place, Joel. It's a feeling. Right now, I'm still finding mine." He nodded, accepting the truth even though it stung. She rose to leave, and as she reached the door, he said, "Thank you for coming." She smiled faintly, a sad, tired smile. "Thank you for listening," she replied. When the door closed behind her, Joel stood still, hand resting on the knob, heart trembling like an old song remembered too late. He went to the balcony and watched her walk away until she disappeared into the rain. He whispered her name once, not expecting her to turn. The city lights flickered in the puddles, and the air smelled of endings and beginnings all at once. Weeks rolled into months again, but something had shifted. Joel no longer hid from his reflection. The shame was still there, but it no longer ruled him. He volunteered at orphanages, taught Bible study for small groups, not as a leader, but as a learner among learners. He spoke less about righteousness and more about fragility, about how even the strongest trees bow in a storm. People who had left the church slowly returned, not because he asked them to, but because they saw something honest in his brokenness. Miriam visited occasionally, always polite, sometimes smiling, sometimes quiet. They spoke like old friends who knew too much to be strangers again, but too wounded to be lovers. There was a gentleness between them, a fragile peace. One Sunday morning, as the choir sang softly, Joel stood at the back of the church instead of the front. He didn't preach, he just listened. The words of the hymn filled the air. "'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." His eyes closed, and a tear slipped down his cheek. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, pouring gold into the sanctuary. For the first time in a long while, Joel smiled, not because he was whole, but because he was healing. And sometimes that was enough. My friends, this story reminds us that even good hearts can make wrong turns, and even strong souls can stumble when they stop guarding what they value most. Temptation doesn't always come roaring. Sometimes it comes softly, through a smile, a compliment, or a moment of loneliness. So when life begins to whisper, remember to listen to your conscience louder than your comfort. Love must be watered with honesty, and trust must be protected like treasure, because once broken, even forgiveness can't always make it whole again. But never forget, failure doesn't mean finality. No matter how deep a man falls, grace still has hands long enough to lift him. Heavenly Father, thank you for the lessons hidden in our pain, for the mercy that still finds us even when we've gone astray. Teach us to guard our hearts and walk wisely when the road seems easy. Give us strength to flee from what looks sweet but leads to sorrow. Heal every marriage torn by silence, every heart wounded by betrayal. Restore peace where trust has been shaken and light where guilt has taken root. Let love rise again, pure and humble, in homes that once knew laughter. And for everyone listening tonight, may grace visit your house, may forgiveness dwell in your spirit, and may peace follow your footsteps all your days. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.